here's something special. This is a Gibson F-4 mandolin from 1913. The F-4 was the fanciest model in Gibson's line at that time. Brief history here. Orville Gibson started experimenting with producing carved top and back instruments, inspired by traditional violin making techniques for his guitars and mandolins. Prior to the turn of the 20th century, the standard mandolin was the same Neapolitan bowl-backed style that had been in use since the 1700s. It has a characteristic sound. There is classical music written for it in mind. And it's a beautiful object that is difficult to hold, and it's also rather quiet. In the 1880s, the mandolin came to America. You could infer that it showed up with Italian immigrants. But the real touch point was a tour of Spanish musicians called Estudiantina Figaro. They showed up in New York in 1880, and they were a huge box office success. They also played Boston and various other East Coast cities. And here's the weird thing. They didn't play mandolins. They played the banderia, which is kind of the Spanish equivalent, sort of. Different tuning, more strings. But it's a small instrument, it's kind of lute-shaped. Anyway, these guys were so successful that imitators quickly popped up, and mandolins were easier to get than bandurias, apparently. So that's what they went with, you know. You had a chorus, a whole bunch of mandolins. That's a recipe for a fantastic night of wholesome entertainment. So these various ensembles piqued the public's interest, and the enthusiasm gradually morphed into mandolin orchestras, where other instruments were incorporated. But by the turn of the century, mandolins were outselling guitars in America. Orville Gibson's designs are fanciful. The decorative aspect of the Neapolitan models was always there. They got adorned with all kinds of pearl and tortoise inlay. But Gibson added some of these crazy, exuberant shapes to the body, as well as, you know, having arched plates and carving and such. You know, he's the one who gives us all of these points and curlicues. Now here's where it gets a bit murky. We've talked about this. Orville didn't stick around long. He had issues. His business partners did not really want him around. He basically did a George Costanza and kept showing up until they paid him to go away. And his designs were novel, but technically they were still quite crude and weird. Like the sides were cut from a single thick block of wood rather than being bent like a violin or a guitar. And the arching profile on original Orville mandolins, the plates, it's weirdly bulbous. You know, it's not very violin-like, but those things eventually got ironed out in the second half of the 1900s, and they became more graceful, like you see here. And by the time this was made in 1913, it was all together as a concept. This is fully formed. Still, these things are infuriatingly complex as objects. There are those who specialize in hand-building exacting replicas of F-style mandolins like this, and they are by necessity the most jig and fixture-oriented micro-community in the lutherie field. Because there's stuff on these that defies sense. Like, the way the headstock end here is angled, it's not perpendicular to the face of the headstock like you find on every other instrument. It's angled back basically on the same plane as the fretboard, perpendicular to that plane. You need a machine to cut that. Binding it gets really, really difficult otherwise. It's pretty, and it makes a certain kind of sense, but, you know, it's the same with the scroll. This is a feat of carving that desperately needs to be mechanized. Violins were designed and built by people who relied on hand tools for everything. They're extremely refined, but the shapes make sense. Even the scroll on the headstock. They're designed around the carving gouge and the shapes that it can make. Doing this stuff by hand and keeping it accurate is, well, it's like trying to build a washing machine from scratch. Like, no one would try, but people do. And you've got the circular cutout here that is designed to break the slightest knock, because it's holding on with one little half-inch piece of end grain here. And, you know, if you look at pictures of Bill Monroe's mandolin in the 1940s, it is broken off, you know. And you've got a headstock that is so weirdly shaped that you have to have tuners with graduated lengths on their shafts. And they're not symmetrical, you know. It's unlike anything else ever manufactured. The music these were conceived for was, again, classical, light opera, choral accompaniment. And Gibson immediately started filling in the gaps by making these in various sizes that correspond to the various violin family instruments for the orchestra, to get your mandocellos, your mando bass. But this thing really did not find its ultimate purpose until Lloyd Loar got a hold of it in the 1920s, got rid of the oval hole and put on a couple of F-holes, redesigned it. By that time, the mandolin popularity was already kind of on the wane. The orchestras were disbanding. But still, it was like 20 years before Bill Monroe got his hands on one and solidified its place in American music. It became a bluegrass machine, you know. And bluegrass, that music is not from olden times. Bluegrass is by and large a post-war invention. So there's this kind of convoluted perception around these things. People assume the oval hole design here is inferior to Lloyd Loar's update with the F-hole violinification. And maybe that's true for a certain purpose. These sound a little bit different from an F-hole, but still very much closer to an F5 than, say, a Neapolitan mandolin. And there are a good many people who actually enjoy playing these a lot. You want a conceptual woodworking challenge for yourself? Devise a system for cutting the oval rosette channel in a mandolin top that is three-dimensional. It's not that hard with a flat piece of wood, but it's got to be consistent, maybe 2 millimeters deep all the way around. And this point here is probably 6 or 7 millimeters taller than this point here. So it undulates. Nowadays you could do it with a CNC, not too hard. Prior to 15 years ago, you probably wanted to have a massive piece of equipment called an overhead pin router. To do this by hand consistently, very difficult. The face of the headstock has been sanded down and stripped. We need to put a finish on that. There is no nut. These were originally furnished with nuts made from mother of pearl, which is an interesting concept. We're missing binding. You can see there's a ledge here where it used to be. On the other side, there's no binding there. Well, there is some over the body, and there is a step down to the ebony side of the fretboard, but where is the ledge? There's no ledge there. And if you look at the side of the neck, it seems to have been profiled, cut flat, as if that ledge has been removed so that someone wouldn't have to put binding on there, which is diabolical. And I can't imagine why. I mean, you'd have to be, I don't know, that's just asinine. So you got a mandolin that's going to have binding on one side of the neck but not the other. Smooth move. Smooth move. There is a bridge. Needs some work. I'm betting that it's too tall for the neck as it is in its current condition. It's also missing a pickguard. We do have the bracket for it, but no actual guard. So we're going to have to make one of those. Then we need frets, because these are grooved right down to the surface of the board, which itself is grooved to the point of unbelief. Look at this thing. I've never seen anything like that. Like the individual courses were scooped out between. That's pretty cool. It can't stay that way, unfortunately. Then we come to the finish. Now, I'm told by the owner that this is correct, that this is supposed to be a natural topped instrument. The back and sides have been stained this really lovely reddish brown color. Shows off the figure beautifully. But apparently this is right. However, apparently it was looking a little dry, and the owner has placed a coat of Danish oil on it. Danish oil is a finish which is sold for reviving fine furniture, etc. It's a mixture of a natural oil, usually linseed oil, occasionally walnut or tung oil. Oftentimes there will be a varnish type additive to give it some body, and solvents. The thing is, if you put Danish oil on a surface, lay it on there, and you don't wipe it off completely, it'll remain as a film on the top surface here, and it will cure, kind of. It won't get rock hard, it will get sticky. And this is something we bring up when people are fanatical about oiling their fretboards. You gotta wipe it all off, because anything that's left over will eventually build up and become sticky. And if you do this on a sealed surface, like this originally had a shellac-based varnish on it, I believe. Could be an oil-based varnish, but whatever. The surface of the spruce has been sealed off for the most part. There's no place for that oil to sink into. There's a barrier. So, yeah, you get a superficial gloss, but this thing will stick right to your arm, and it's really annoying. Like, it's really sticky. So I've got to somehow deal with that. So I ruminated and I came up with an order of operations. Some things need to be done before others. I'm going to start by addressing the fretboard. I need to make that smooth and flat before I consider the binding, and I wouldn't want to do any finishing work while there's ebony dust floating around. In this time period, mandolin boards are flat, no radius, like a classical guitar. I mean, it's not like you spend a lot of time barring mandolin chords, but these days a lot of makers will add some radius. And the other thing to consider, of course, is frets. The owner wants stock vintage frets, and that's weird. The standard modern mandolin wire is about 53 thousandths of an inch wide, which is okay, but a lot of people actually prefer a wider wire. Seems counterintuitive, right? The space between the frets is so narrow. Doesn't the bigger wire make things even more cramped? It doesn't appear so, because so many people like that. Probably 80% of the refrets I do, they end up choosing small guitar wire, which is like 80 thousandths wide. The vintage standard on here, 43 thousandths. 20% thinner. They are so thin. There's one company that still makes it. That's Dunlop, and they don't seem to make it that often, because it goes out of stock and stays out of stock for many, many months or years. And most of the supply seems to end up in Europe for whatever reason, so if you can find a reseller, shipping gets expensive. I found some. Measuring these grooves in the board, they look super deep, but they're really only about 10 thousandths of an inch, which is pretty deep for ebony. But I can dress that out, not a problem. The necks in these are proportionally deeper than they are wide, which is good because they don't have truss rods. So we do have to be careful. We don't want to introduce excessive relief into the neck or excessive back bow because we can't adjust it out. And the frets are so tiny that there isn't a whole lot of height to dress away. They start off slightly less than 30 thousandths of an inch tall. So when doing this kind of stuff, I try to make the boards dead flat and then introduce a couple of thousandths worth of back bow while fretting. So, they end up reversed. That'll get pulled out by the string tension, which is pretty considerable on a mandolin, leaving us with between 5 and 10 thousandths of an inch relief. These are the mental games you start playing when you're dealing with non-truss rod instruments. So let's pull these frets. Now, if you believe it, these go into fret slots that are basically the same as we use now. They're pretty normal size, which means the overhang is like less than 10,000ths of an inch on either side. So there's frequently a little bit of damage that occurs when these come out, but we do our best. It's ebony. It's 110 years old. So be really gentle. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, it crumbles. It's what old ebony does. So we get some ebony dust and a little bit of super glue, and we glue the darn thing back together. I'm going to peel this binding off. I'm also going to measure it. Seems to be just under 40,000ths of an inch here. Now I will level sand the surface. With the surface flattened out, I can then reestablish the fret slots. The new wire, I believe, is maybe 10,000ths of an inch deeper than the old wire. Trying to reconstruct what the binding channel looked like using the base side as reference. Seems to taper fairly significantly. From about 30,000ths, use an area where it wasn't broken off. Down on this end, around 20,000ths. I'm not sure I'm going to get that much out of this side. You know, I really don't want to remove more wood off the side of this neck. I think I'd rather try and shape it into the binding. Because, yeah, ordinarily the binding isn't rectangular in section. It'll be thinner towards the base where it kind of follows the neck. It's carved into the curve here. It follows the curve around. So I'm thinking maybe 15 to 20,000ths. And just try and shape it into the binding. So I'll use tape as an intermediary and super glue a piece of straight plywood to the surface of the board. And I'll use a feeler gauge to give me the amount of cut that I want, and just get that where I want it and press it down and let it cure. Checking to make sure the depth of cut is correct. I really don't want to cut into the neck proper. I want it all to happen in the fretboard. We'll check the fit. That seems good. The little dipsy doodle at the end of the fretboard here requires attention. Some skillful mitering of the parts so they fit together. It's a bit fiddly because there are curves involved. This is an ABS binding. It's not celluloid. And it requires the surfaces to be roughed up a bit so that the thick super glue that I'm using is going to have something to bond to. I do it in sections. Have to heat bend the area around the little tongue on the extension. There's one case where I don't use glue in the slots. I'll put it in afterwards, wicking some super glue. Yeah, just like doing a regular fret job, except it's not. These vintage ones, ancient fretboards, they're really chippy, and you have to adjust everything a lot. Tend to trim the ends as I go because I don't want them sticking out. There's so much finagling to do. I'm filing down the barbs slightly for a looser fit in the slot. I'll come back and wick in some super glue from both sides to make sure they're really held in place securely. The fret dressing procedure proceeds as usual. Have to be careful, of course, because there's not a whole lot of height to these. The only weird stuff happens at the end of the board. To get the bevels on this area, I have to use some Swiss files and some patience. Dressing doesn't take long. And of course, polishing. I'll spray on some amber lacquer to replicate the effects of age. I'm going to mix up some shellac because I'm going to do some French polishing on this thing. If I didn't French polish it, I think the ghost of Frank Ford might appear and chastise me, because it is the appropriate finish. So I'm using a blonde de-waxed shellac flake. I'll mix up a 2-pound cut, which is old-timey. It's 2 pounds of shellac flake in a gallon of alcohol, which is too much for anybody. I use significantly smaller proportions. I work in metric, but the ratio stays the same. For jobs like this, I'm also going to add a little bit of Sanderac resin. We're getting into sort of the spirit varnish recipes from the violin guys. Sanderac is a gum which is exuded by little trees that are, I think they're in the cypress family, native to northwest Africa, the Atlas Mountains of Morocco. So yeah, it's kind of rare, pretty darn expensive stuff. In medieval and early Renaissance times, this was one of the main components in varnish. They'd heat this up and liquefy it and add it to virtually boiling hot linseed oil. Traditional oil varnish making is an extremely dangerous process. You know, heating turpentine to just below its flash point. There were plenty of accidents. Eventually less expensive resins were found that could do the job, like copal and such. These days I think it's really only the violin trade that is interested in Sanderac, basically. What it does is it modifies the straight shellac and makes it tougher. It's less prone to scratching and it's a little bit harder. Sanderac is basically the hardest natural resin. And you don't need much, you know, less than 10% of the weight of the shellac. In my case, if I'm adding 30 grams of shellac to half a cup of alcohol, I'll put in maybe 2 grams of Sanderac. Little goes a long way. If you use too much, it can get brittle. It'll crackle like old lacquer, but not in a good way. So I mix these together and add some alcohol, stir it around and dissolve it. Takes about a day and it'll be ready to use tomorrow. I'll also filter this through a coffee filter because, like, this stuff, you know, it's probably harvested by hand from trees and there's likely to be, you know, little ant bodies and stuff in there as well. There's a stick. So, you know, it's good to try to get that stuff out before you start using it as a finish. As I mentioned, this has been slathered with a Danish oil blend. It's a finishing product. Because that went over the surface that was sealed and non-absorbent, and because it wasn't wiped off, the oil sat on the surface and polymerized to a certain extent. In 20 years it might actually get rock hard, but until then it's going to feel really sticky. That polymerizing, the molecules of the oil and other components in the varnish, they rearrange themselves as they oxidize and dry out, and they become insoluble in the solvent that previously held them in suspension. So I can't just wipe this down with solvent and clean it off. The other problem is that it's sitting on top of a shellac-based varnish, and that could also be affected by those solvents, maybe even more than the Danish oil. At this point, the safest thing to do is just very carefully sand the surface. You know, I'm going to try and abrade off what's there of the Danish oil, and also get rid of a lot of these little bumps and dust motes, and there's all kinds of like lint in that oil, inclusions, and it's really gritty. Should you apply a finishing oil to revive what looks like an old dry finish on an instrument? No. What about furniture polish? Absolutely not. Things like pledge, there's silicone and other stuff in there that does real harm, especially if we ever want to do a glue repair. Basically, if it's dirty, use a lightly dampened cloth. And then you can use a proprietary guitar cleaner or use naphtha, lighter fluid. That's pretty much it. You don't want to go trying to moisten, for lack of a better term, a finish that's either a varnish or lacquer or what have you. Oil-based finishes, different story. To be honest, you probably shouldn't be messing with those. And you're not likely to find one on a commercial instrument. So I'll slowly be building coats of shellac for quite some time. Gotta make a pickguard. Special thank you to those vintage dealers like Folkway Music and Elderly Instruments who take really exquisite photos and archive them on their websites so that people like me who are trying to piece something together have some visual reference. This picture was from Elderly. It was scaled 1:1. I brought it up on my desktop monitor, put a ruler on it, and the size was right on. So I took a tracing of this guard for a mandolin that's 1 year younger. It's a 1914. But, you can see they have this characteristic pointy hook that wraps around the bridge, which is sort of fun. And also the guard is shaped to wrap around the fingerboard extension. And it's useful, to find things like the positioning pins and where the support bracket should be located, all that stuff. The photo also shows me that there's a double thickness of material along the edge of the guard to reinforce it and stiffen it. I made a routing template, which I'll glue to my tortoise plastic, and then use a flush trim bit to cut the outline. Need to chamfer or soften the edges. I'll use a razor blade as a scraper for that. Several days later, I'm into the actual polishing part of the French polishing. In this process, it gets really shiny. Too shiny, in fact, but it's good practice. I'll clean the accumulated gunk out of the tuner holes with a single pass from my reamer. And the set of tuners that was provided, of course, one of the bushings was not like the others. So I had to go searching through my stash to find something that would work. And the other thing is the screw holes for the tuners had been stripped out. I need to plug those and re-drill. Headstock's looking pretty good to me. I knocked back some of the super high gloss so that it doesn't look brand spanking new. I can tell already that some of these tuners are going to be pretty squirrely, but tuners that are 110 years old, they're not going to work like brand new ones. This body, however, I'm annoyed with it in a way that's maybe not rational. I have to reconcile myself to the fact it's never going to be what I want. The solvents that were in the Danish oil seem to have melted into the original varnish, allowing the oil to puddle in little craters. Not fully hardening, of course. So I polish over and they depress, making little pock marks. When I try and buff it up, the shininess throws everything into stark relief. So all the pick wear, all of the sunken grain lines, all of the uneven surfaces, it's never going to look even. I suppose it could all be sanded off down to the bare wood and a new finish put on there, which is undesirable for a number of reasons. Also, there's enough wear and staining on parts of this soundboard that you'd have to sand off too much to get below that. It would be very uneven, even in the best case scenario. So that's not something that should be done. I've been burnishing this with a clean cloth just to bring up a shine, make it lustrous. And I'm just going to leave it be, It's no longer sticky, it's nice and smooth, and the surface is protected, but it looks like a mandolin that has been played hard for a very long time, which is what it is. The lesson to take from this is don't mess around with finishes on vintage instruments. Do you have years of experience as a conservator in a museum? Have you been repairing antique furniture for a prestigious auction house for several decades? As if not, anything you do to try and make a 100-plus-year-old finish look better is likely to backfire. You've been warned. Just let it be. I need to make a nut. The owner sent along a number of original mother-of-pearl nuts. However, these are all too narrow. They're about 1.1/16", which is around 27 millimeters, which is thought of as the standard size and has been for more than 100 years. However, that was a Lloyd Loar number. That's the 1920s. He settled on that width. Previously, they had wider nuts. If you read enough online, you'll find that the consensus seems to be 1 3/16 of an inch, which is around 30 millimeters, which is like 1/8 of an inch or 3.2 millimeters wider. But that's not set in stone. There seems to be a lot of variation. My neck here has dressed out to just about 29 millimeters, so somewhere in between. Not ridiculously large, but not the standard either. The pearl, really, in every case, has aged to, well, it's aged in a way that is not particularly pearly, except on the surface that contacted the fretboard. It looks pretty similar to old bone. These are also much too short. I believe Lloyd Loar thinned the fretboard dimension down a bit, so these would require a shim of about 2 millimeters under them to get enough height. And finding mother of pearl in these dimensions is not particularly easy, because shipping it across international borders is difficult. It's on various treaty lists. STUMAC carries them. They can't ship outside the USA. And, you know, you can find them on eBay, but it's like $160 for one nut blank. I don't feel bad about using bone. Laying out string spacing on a mandolin takes forever. I'm stringing up. I've got tailpiece on here. Just look at this notch here for the top string. Seems a little different from the others. That appears to have been brazed back on after calamity struck. That occasionally happens with these, and sometimes it can be kind of dramatic. So just, if you notice something like that, just be really careful when you're tuning up, because sometimes it'll come loose and it'll shoot across the room and hopefully not into your body. Oh, and for people who don't know, there seem to be extra notches here. The top ones, this is more of a positioning thing so they could fit all of these strings into place. It's more of a guide than it is an actual hook. Yeah, so you just got to follow these around. I'm setting this up initially with some light gauge strings. These are D'Addario's 10 to 34s, which is really light. But, old mandolin, no truss rod. I want to see how it behaves. The 34s, it's a big jump in the D'Addario. They go from a 34 to a 38 to a 40. So if this decides that it's okay and we want to go up a size, then I'll likely have to recut these bass string slots to accommodate the larger string. But we shall see where it ends up. Initial action is just about a 32nd of an inch, and I know some people who would love that. Looking at you, Sean. But this being a non-adjustable bridge, and it's September, I don't really want to let that go. These things are usually set up at the factory somewhere around a 16th of an inch, 4/64ths, 62 thousandths, 1.5 millimeters. And that's a fairly good average. Most people are happy with that. Some people like it lower. Some people, initially these were set up higher than that, obviously. 5/64ths is pretty common. But yeah, so in this case, I'm going to be adding a slip of veneer to the underside of this bridge, which is the elegant way to do it. In the event that it ever needs lowering against, you can just peel off the veneer. But the top surface seems to be fine. The strings are, in a reasonably flat plane. I'm really happy with the relief in the neck. It's only been strung up for 15-20 minutes now. But it looks like we've got about 4 thousandths, 5 thousandths, that's great. Couldn't ask for better. Also, looking at the initial impression of the pickguard here, I think I'm probably going to end up having to add a little bit of extra plastic on this side for the pin, which is supported in a hole that's drilled through the bridge. There's some felt that's stuffed in there to keep it from rattling. But yeah, I kind of missed the mark by 1/16 of an inch over here. The other thing is, depending on how the bracket turns out, I might want to remove a little bit of material in this area, which is getting kind of hung up on the hump there. Although, maybe not. Maybe it'll stay. We'll see. I glued 2 millimeters worth of veneer to the bottom of the bridge. I'm just scraping it flush. Then I'll sand. Period appropriate vintage 1911 patented Pickguard bracket. And the celluloid is in reasonable shape. Drilling holes for the positioning pins. That fits nicely. Now I just need to adhere the pickguard to the bracket. I'm going to use epoxy. I figure it'd be easier to cut through if someone ever wanted to change this at some point. Why? I don't know. But of course these surfaces need to be scored slightly so that there's good mechanical bond between the parts. Someplace for the epoxy to grip. I'm going to lightly sand with some high grit micro mesh. This is going to knock off the absolutely pristine surface and give it that slightly starburst halo effect. It's really difficult to fake wear on these kinds of parts in a way that looks right, and it's going to happen anyway as it's being played, so I'm just going to knock off the newness at this point. This is kind of a clever solution on Gibson's part. The hole is oversized and is stuffed with wool around the pin so that it's held in place and not vibratory. This bridge has apparently been used for decades and yet still has a very sharp point where your hand rests against it. Got to take care of that. Need to put the cover on the tailpiece so we don't mistake this thing for the work of some other manufacturer. Okay, I think that's enough of that for the moment. Still a few little jobs to do. I've got to put an end pin in. The one I've got here is a bit too loose and it needs a pearl dot. I'll find one of those. But it's back together and playable, and I think it's in slightly better shape than when it arrived.